So once again, welcome Daniel Silva, Ben Ramptom, and Constadina Charalambous. I will introduce first Constadina. She's an assistant professor of language education and literacy at the European University, Cyprus. Her research interests evolve around language education in relation to larger cultural and socio-political ideologies, and especially in relation to peace education, and more recently, processes of insecurity. Her work is published in many international journals and in co-authored monograph at CUP 2016. She's the leading investigator of the project Politico. So welcome, Constadina. And of course, the title, by the way, of our session is Sociolinguistics and Insecurization. Next, I will introduce to you our second speaker, Daniel Silva. Welcome, Daniel. Daniel teaches sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, and linguistic anthropology at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. He also teaches as a collaborator in the graduate program of applied linguistics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. His research focuses on language, violence, and hope in Rio de Janeiro's favelas. His fieldwork in Brazilian peripheries has led to publications and collaborative work on language and resistance, including Marielle Present, Metaleptic Temporality, and Registerment of Hope in Rio de Janeiro. In 2012, he published the result of his doctoral research on symbolic violence against nordestinos in Brazil into the book Pragmatics of Violence, the Northeast in the Brazilian Media, published in Portuguese. And finally, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Ben Ramptom. I've been said that an introduction is unnecessary as his fame precedes him. And also he asked to be very brief. So I would just say that Professor Ben Ramptom, about his research interests, he's in King's College, London, and his interests are ethnographic and interactional discourse analysis. He cross-refers quite frequently to work in anthropology, sociology, and cultural studies, and his publications cover urban multilingualism, language, youth, popular culture, ethnicities, and class, language education and classroom discourse, second language learning, and research methodology. So welcome, everyone, and over to our guest speakers.
Well, thanks. First of all, thank you very much indeed for this invitation. We'll start off with we'll move between us in PowerPoint presentation. So I'll go to screen share to begin with. Can you see that? Yeah. Can you see that? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in this presentation, we're going to talk about securitization as a way of managing populations, a way of managing populations that suspends normal laws and rules that guide citizens in contemporary democracies, and instead people act as if they're facing existential threats of violence and death in a state of exception. Securitization is a practice of making enemy and fear the integrative, energetic principle of politics, displacing democratic principles of freedom and justice, and like communication itself, it usually works in two or more directions. Security to one person can be insecurity to another, and this can change quite quickly. Change with the situation, change quite quickly, and to catch that duality, we're going to talk about insecuritization with the in brackets. I suppose we could say security / insecurity. What we're going to do is we're going to argue that insecuritization really ought to be more of a theme, major theme in sociolinguistics, joining big concepts like standardization and commodification, so that security becomes a fundamental issue for research on language policy, public discourse, language learning, ground level interactional practice. All these areas of research are sensitive to the dynamics of insecuritization, alongside issues like correctness or profit. I'm going to start off with some general comments, and then we'll move to two empirical cases. Daniel will talk about how Brazilian citizens living in favelas experience and resist the necro power of drug traffickers and the police. And then Constadina will look at some language classes in Cyprus that were introduced as part of post-conflict reconciliation. These are very different situations, ongoing violence in one and a legacy of war in the other. But in both, we'll see insecuritization getting tangled up with language standardization, which you couldn't understand on its own. But let's start with a quick historical sketch of big preoccupations in sociolinguistics and the conspicuous omission of what we'll be talking about today. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing for a second. Contemporary sociolinguistics really took off in the 1960s and 70s, starting in the US, but spreading rapidly to other countries. In this period, the 60s and 70s, the central issue for sociolinguistics was linguistic diversity. And domestically, in places like the US and the UK, the main backdrop to this, the main antagonist, was the nation state. It was nation states that promoted monolingual standard languages, mainly through education. And for sociolinguists at the time, this emphasis on monolingual standards did two bad things. A, this emphasis derogated non-standard dialects, neglecting their systematicity and eloquence. And B, it squeezed out indigenous and migrant minority languages. Like lots of the humanities and social sciences at the time, sociolinguistics bore the stamp of methodological nationalism. But then the 1990s brought globalized neoliberal marketization. States were then redefined, and a lot of their services were handed over to the private sector. In public culture, the consumer and the entrepreneur took over from the ideal of the literate citizen, and walls, borders, and boundaries gave way to flows of products, people, and ideas. All of that registered with sociolinguists, and their interests now expanded beyond standardization to the commodification of language. Concepts like speech community were placed in scare quotes, and as Sinfrey and others have shown us, the idea that languages like English or Spanish were natural unitary entities gave way to an understanding that named languages are products fashioned out of lots of different resources, repackaged and branded for lots of different purposes in lots of different markets. Indeed, the very identity of sociolinguistics itself was heavily affected by the big changes that came with the 1990s. Universities acquired a new socioeconomic mission, which undermined the old disciplinary boundaries, and in a kind of growing climate of interdisciplinarity, sociolinguists started to engage seriously with scholars elsewhere in the humanities and social sciences, maybe the most prominent being Bourdieu and Foucault. So So language standardization and the commodification of language have been big themes in sociolinguistics over the last 50 years. They both spread from strong institutional bases, the state and the economy, but they certainly aren't mutually exclusive, and they're also often interwoven with other ideologies and cultural regimes which shape and constrain relations and identities in households, voluntary associations, places of worship, etc., as we've seen in rich sociolinguistic literatures on language socialization, language and gender, youth language, etc., etc. But this literature, we think, has had a lot less to say about insecuritization, even though insecuritization has been hugely influential in the past and is now impossible to overlook, even in the in the oldest and wealthiest democracies. So let's now turn to insecuritization, comparing it with language standardization, also bringing in some Foucault and Mbembe. And maybe at this, I mean, I ought to just say that we wrote this talk. We wrote this talk before, the events, awful events in the Ukraine, though they kind of cast a, well, hard to say. Let me go back to screen sharing. Okay. Screen sharing. Good. Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, language standardization has played a major role in the formation of European nation states, not just as an emblem of national unity and heritage, but also as a routine element in what Foucault calls normalization, the processes of comparison, stratification, and division that operate whenever linguistic practice gets formally assessed in exams, tests, interviews, job applications, and so forth. Normalization is one central procedure in the large-scale operation of power in democratic societies, and it blends into the broader sphere of biopolitics, which refers to the administration of bodies and the calculated management of life, governing populations through systematic monitoring and regulation of living organisms, demographics, health and hygiene, policing techniques. Now, language standardization has also been important in the organization of colonial rule. And of course, colonies have been vital in the development of European nation states, providing them with crucial material resources and so forth. But colonies are the location par excellence where the controls and guarantees of judicial order can be suspended, the zone where the violence of the state of exception is deemed to operate in the service of civilization. That colonies might be ruled over in absolute lawlessness, adds Mbembe, stems from the racial denial of any common bond between the conqueror and native. And Foucault concurs, in a normalizing society, race or racism is the precondition that makes killing acceptable. In this context, argues Mbembe, the notion of biopower is insufficient to account for forms of subjugation of life to the power of death. And instead, he proposes necropower and necropolitics. Now, Mbembe cites plantation slavery as a clear example of necropolitical governance, and as well as discussing the prohibition of literacy among slaves, there is Gilroy's characterization of the communicative dynamics of plantation slavery. And I'll just leave you just to read it, just to read that. And one obvious conclusion to draw from this is that language standardization is only one part of the sociolinguistic story of European nation-state formation. European modernity was resourced by institutions that operated necropolitical regimes and that pushed towards silence and the negation of language, a long way off from the appropriately regulated literate speech of a standard language. Admittedly, it might be hard to claim that sociolinguistics should pay more attention to necropower if plantation slavery was the only example, but necropower takes contemporary as well as historical forms, and Mbembe refers to the management of flows of refugees and to late modern colonial occupation, as in Gaza and the West Bank. In addition, its necropower is exercised through a broad range of different techniques and practices. And crucially, it is often mixed up with other modes of governance in what Mbembe calls a combining of the disciplinary, the biopolitical, and the necropolitical. Now, for us, it generally makes more sense to talk about insecuritization than necropower, because we've been collaborating quite closely with researchers Dina and I have been collaborating quite closely with researchers in critical security studies, but necropower and insecuritization are closely aligned, and necropower underscores insecuritization's colonial pedigree, its profound links with racialization, and its potential impact on language. The distinction between biopower and necropower maybe also helps us differentiate the kinds of insecurity and surveillance experienced during the COVID pandemic from the kinds of insecurity and surveillance that we're going to describe in Cyprus and Brazil. Ethnographic sociolinguistics, we argue, has the analytical tools for an empirically nuanced account of insecuritization and the ways in which insecuritization gets tangled up with other modes of governance. And in previous work, we proposed a definition of insecuritization tuned to everyday interaction, saying that insecuritization is an intensifying apprehension of institutionally authorized vulnerability and existential threat produced and received in communicative practice in a range of social settings. But that's what we've been kind of working with so far. But the terrain where this apprehension develops deserves fuller specification. So here's a schematic comparison with of insecuritization and commodification, even though they're all actually mixed. There you are. You might want to take a second just to look at that. Okay, so that's, if you like, our schematization of how insecuritization connects with other big themes in sociolinguistics. But you can't predict any of this away from particular empirical scenes. You have to work empirically in empirical sites. And so now let's turn, I'll hand over to Daniel first, and let's turn to this. I'll stop screen sharing now and hand over to Daniel.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm going to project my screen here. All right. Since 2012, I have done ethnographic research and teaching in Complexo do Alemão. It's a group of 12 favelas in Rio de Janeiro. Favelas are neighborhoods self-built by their residents. They were first formed in Rio after Brazil's reluctant abolition of slavery in 1888. In the absence of public policies to support freed enslaved people and their descendants, they had to find their own solutions to housing and income needs. Favela residents now represent 22% of Rio's population, being for the most part Black and migrants from the Nordeste, Brazil's poorest region where I actually come from. Since 1980, in Brazil, urban violence has significantly risen. This has coincided with economic crisis, both during and in the aftermath of the military dictatorship here that lasted from 1964 to 1985, and we have a supported of that now in the executive. And also this rise of violence coincided with rising levels of unemployment and inequality resulting from neoliberal state reforms. Further, as the Sociology of Violence in Rio put it, as criminal organizations were settled in Rio's favelas and expanded there, these territories came to be seen as the stronghold of criminals who interrupt ordinary life in the city. And consequently, in the public world, favelas have no longer been discussed in the language of rights as they were in the 60s, but instead in the language of urban violence. And I'm citing Machado da Silva and Paloma Menezes here. In addition to being framed in public discourses as strongholds of criminals, favelas are the object of disputes between two normative regimes of governance, the state and the quote-unquote world of crime. In favelas, the police and drug traffic exemplify these regimes. The sociology of violence in Brazil and in Rio particularly points that the crossfire between crime and the state impedes the pursuits of residents' routines and renders difficult the public manifestation of their demands. I'm quoting Machado da Silva and Menezes again. To provide an ethnographic example of the anti-discursive effects in Gilroy's terms, as Ben pointed a few minutes ago, of this armed control and surveillance, I will play a video from an interview that my research group in Rio did in 2012 with Rafael Calazans, a young Black activist and social work student. Now he's a social worker. We were outside a station of the cable car that at the time connected the favelas of Complexo do Alemão. Today, this cable car is deactivated as a sign of precariousness that has risen since the ouster of the Workers' Party in 2016. So 10 minutes after the start of the interview, we were surprised by a traffic lookout who had been watching us in the conversation.
Na verdade, assim, um irmão meu morreu, o outro começou uma época assim, a estudar à noite, e aí, depois da noite, só interrompi, assim, acho que eu ia na favela, estava pensando umas coisas que eu queria, crianças de moradores, pode dar lá de um balão, e aí, assim,
We hadn't noticed what was going wrong, yet Calazans' discourse, which had been dynamic and fast, suddenly falters as his attention shifts to a motorcyclist who starts his motorcycle after watching us for a couple minutes. Calazans then told us that we had been surveilled by a lookout working for drug traffickers. But there was no comfort from a police presence either. About half an hour later, a passing police car had a similar effect on Calazans' talk. Calazans again shifts his attention away from us and toward the movement of the surveilling agents, and his talk falters once more. A fuller account of the part that the police played in the non-dialogical dynamics of armed control over favelas was provided by Mateus, a young participant of a focus group, discussion at Vila Cruzeiro, a favela bordering Complexo do Alemão. We had been discussing this documentary that's on the screen now, Depois Rola o Mocotó, which can be translated as Then We'll Eat Bone Marrow, a documentary about the collective and solidary construction of rooftop slabs in favelas. Mateus responded to a question that had been posed about the police approach to favela residents along these lines. So he said, on Sunday, I was in the store where I work, I was talking to my boss, gunshots broke out, everybody ran to the store. A group of cops passed by and stopped at the corner. Then my boss began joking with the people and I started laughing. And then the last one in line saw me laughing and came with a rifle pointed at my face in my direction, cursing me, shouting loudly, asking me why I was laughing. And now I'm already surrounded. I'm already have the rifle in my face. And if it wasn't for my boss to intervene, I would have been beaten up, taken to the alley, and killed. In Brazilian Portuguese, a slang term for this form of harsh police approach is dura. The word duro originally means hard in Portuguese, and its feminine form, dura, is a slang analog for a police verbal and violence physical approach. Mateus continues his narrative by saying that the next day, others told him that they also had been endured duras over comparably ordinary activities. So he says, after the police saw it, the next day they were saying, oh, this has happened to me. The other day I was flying a kite, I was drilling a spot on the terrace, and they approached me aggressively. Me deram uma dura. And Mateus concludes with meta-pragmatics comments about police training. So they come very aggressively, their way of seeing is different. They're not told, look, you're going to a place that is like this, you have to be patient, you have to talk and have that dialogue with the people. They come, hey, it's going to be like this, and that's it, without conversation, without anything. This stretch has an important meta-pragmatic evaluation about the verbal action of the police. Mateus formulates some rather elaborate comments about intercultural communication. So you see in lines 34 to 36, that he says, their way of seeing is different. They're not told, look, you're going to a place that is like this, you have to be patient, you have to talk and have that dialogue with people. That is, he comments that sociocultural differences between favelados and middle class subjects requires a different training for the police based on tropes such as patience and dialogue. Yet, in contrast to this, the young resident says that the police are harsh and conversationally uncooperative. And to exemplify this, in line 40, he uses a stereotypical stretch of reported speech. Hey, it's going to be like this, and that's it. As if iterating Hannah Arendt's key that violence begins where speech ends, Mateus adds that the police bold imperatives are equivalent to approaching residents without conversation, without anything. In the field, I have also witnessed organized community work to protect residents from armed violence and propose affirmative racial linguistic narratives about favelados or favela residents. An important collective of counter-securitization is the Coletivo Papo Reto, or Straight Talk Collective. It was formed in Complexo do Alemão in 2014 by a group of activists. You see some of them in the picture, with a human rights agenda that includes denouncing police abuse and valorizing local ways of life. Papo Reto, or straight talk, is a common meta-pragmatic term in non-standard Portuguese. And in the favela, dar papo reto, or to give a straight talk, means to communicate something directly, usually with non-standard language and suspension of expectations of face. Some of the collective's members, as I said, can be seen in this figure. I will name them clockwise from top to left. You see Lana Souza, Raul Santiago, Renata Trajano, Tainá Medeiros, Ananda Trajano, and Bento Fábio. The central caption in the picture reads, "Quem faz o papo reto acontecer," or "Who makes the straight talk happen?" This image circulated in the collective's Twitter profile. Here, the activists creatively scrambled the line between vernacular and official discourse by declaring their papo reto identity in the paradigmatic genre of language standardization, the dictionary entry, printing it on the most basic and unpretentious item of everyday dress, the t-shirt. It's good to read the definition, so we have it transcribed here. The definition reads, papo reto, it's a popular slang. It's one, a person who positions himself or herself objectively. Two, an attitude of someone who doesn't deceive. Three, those who are not fans of scoundrels. Four, a collective of communication and human rights that is active in Complexo do Alemão. In 2019, at a public meeting in a peripheral district in São Paulo, Raul Santiago, one of the Coletivo's activists, explained the collective's formation, rationale, and strategy. Speaking to an audience that included favela residents, Raul said that in addition to favela resident, human rights activist, and favela mobilizer, he likes to define himself as entrepreneur of words. He adds, "I was born with the gift of speech. I'm fucking talkative." He thus uses slang and suspends conventional politeness, suggesting from the outset that his talk would be enunciated in a papo reto activist register. Portraying himself as a graduate in Streetology, Ruologia, with a postgraduate degree in Ciências Periféricas or Peripheral Sciences. I like these terms. He stressed that his political literacy comes not from universities, but from the street. Embodying this persona, Raul then performed his talk in a poetics similar to the style of rappers and pastors, with a fast rhythm and few pauses. It's a rather long talk, so I just highlighted some stretches that are good for our argument. So from 2 to 5, he says that the main investment is still violence against our people, coming as a security policy discourse, a public security that doesn't include us, favela residents. And then 15 to 19, he says that if people got together to make a protest in an access road, the press would come and say that the protest was orchestrated by crime. The police were the only final voice to speak about that moment. It was never our voice as the final voice. And then he points to the change in that when we started to have access to the internet and to have the possibility to have better equipment, like a good cell phone, I started to try to record this as much as possible. So we got together and started to monitor. And then the Coletivo Papo Reto emerged to talk about violence, to talk about how we live from us to ourselves first, and then from us to the outside. That is to try to organize people to not accept that the main public policy for Blacks and the poor is violence as state rule. Papo Reto Collective defied the code of silence and the official accounts of police and press, appropriating the power of representation with digital media and the internet. In lines 7 to 8, Raul recognizes private interests in securitization of favelas. He says, there is, in line 9, he says, there is someone paying for it. To resist this scenario, Papo Reto worked with video and social media to form a range of alternative alliances. They partnered with local collectives and national and international institutions. And all of this guided by a nós por nós, us, for ourselves, a major contemporary activist trope in Brazilian peripheries. There's a great article by Branca Fabrício and Glenda Mello in Papers in Applied Linguistics about this. In lines 34 to 35, he says that in talking from us to ourselves first and then from us to the outside, the mediational role of Papo Reto as a discursive style and as an emblem was crucial. As symbolized in the dictionary entry T-shirt inscription, Papo Reto pushed for wider recognition and understanding. It deconstruction and opened up the public debates conducted in standard bureaucratic language and without masking its identity as the voice of the people that live in our reality. It mixed with the global English of international organizations. These empirical fragments should be sufficient to show favela residents having to contend with conditions close to the necropolitical states of exception that Ben sketched. For instance, ruled through violence and death, racialization, suspicion, fear, and constant alertness, and policies and practices in which obedient silence is a central stake in tense language ideological struggle. At the same time, collectives like Papo Reto orient to a progressive Latin American conception of citizen security that connects to UN's definitions of security as human security as that which protects human freedoms. In resisting this coercive exceptionalization and its portrayal of local people as enemies, the political strategy of activists operates at the nexus of counter-securitization and language ideology. They refuse the equation of political voice with standard Portuguese, insisting on inclusion without relinquishing their sociolinguistic identity. Now, we should move to our second empirical site, Cyprus, with Gina Charalambous.
Daniel, just let me also upload my presentation. So is everything okay?
Yep.
Good. So we're now moving from Brazil to Cyprus to a very different context, where insecurity and insecuritization, they don't relate as much with direct violence, but rather with a legacy of interethnic conflict between the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities living on the island. Now, most historians trace the roots of the conflict in the transition from the Ottoman Empire to British administration. And in fact, language had an important role to play in the formation of the conflict. Because whereas in Ottoman Empire ruled according to the Millet system, that is according to religious communities, British administration classified people as members of linguistic groups. And despite the local vernacular spoken on the island, it was standard Greek and standard Ottoman and later on Turkish that became the main categories of classification now in Cyprus. And this gave rise to a new ethno-linguistic identity and also an increased need for literacy, as citizens needed to communicate with the British authorities through documents in standard languages. And education became responsible for maintaining the link with the motherlands, with teachers and books being imported from there. Now it will locate this to the general historical context with the rival Greek and Turkish nationalists, as the two countries at the time were engaged in a series of wars. We can see how former Christian and Muslim communities on the island came to imagine themselves now as part of two opposing motherlands and as perennial enemies. And this gave rise to intercommunal hostility, especially in the mid of the 20th century, as Greek Cypriots fought for unification with Greece and Turkish Cypriots for independence. Cyprus was declared an independent state in 1960, and it was established as bicommunal and bilingual state. But this barely lasted 3 years, and there was again intercommunal violence. The conflict culminated in 1974. A pro-Greek coup overthrew the legal president of the republic, and this was followed by the violent intervention of Turkish forces who invaded and occupied the northern third of the island, as you can see in the picture. And since then, the island remains divided between the Greek-speaking southern part, the government-controlled areas, and the northern Turkish-speaking part, the self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. And between these two parts are divided by physical borders and UN buffer zone, and communication until 2003 was impossible. So I grew up and I never had the chance to cross to the other side or meet a Turkish Cypriot. However, in 2003, Cyprus sought to enter the European Union and to reimagine Cypriot identity within open transnational market. And this created new dynamics, possibilities, and a momentum for reconciliation. Now, this brief historical sketch helps us to show how geopolitical configurations and modes of governance that are usually overlapping impact language practices, language use, and language learning that I will talk about in a minute. And we can see also some examples after the de facto division of the island. We see Greek, for example, being erased from the northern part, whereas in the southern government control areas, Turkish is still an official language of the Republic and is being used in all government documents, which supports the argument that the Cyprus Republic continues to function unaltered since 1960, with the northern part being kind of a state of exception. And these different politics, of course, are related to different political imaginings and different versions of Cypriotness. These geopolitical configurations also had an impact on language learning processes. And we see, for example, that although the Turkish Cypriots as the minority were bilingual in Turkish and the local variety of Greek spoken on the island, with the culmination of the conflict in the 50s, using Greek was even penalized. And despite the independence and the constitution of Cyprus as a bilingual state, education was always monolingual, and there was never the provision to teach each other languages. In fact, learning the other language was considered kind of an act of betrayal and a security breach, and it was restricted to police and espionage. But with the EU accession in 2003 and the new momentum for reconciliation, there was also a new possibility for Turkish language learning in the Greek Cypriot education. So, as I said, that was the year that Cyprus entered the European Union, and part of the treaty, the accession treaty, said that although the body of the European law would remain suspended in the north, Turkish Cypriots should have all the rights of EU citizens. And as part of the political negotiations at the time, the Cyprus government offered a package of measures to Turkish Cypriots to make sure that they enjoy all the rights that citizens have. These measures had to do with access to hospitals and identity cards and passports, But what is of interest for us here is that they also included the introduction of the Turkish language to Greek Cypriot education as part of modern foreign language curricula. And as we've argued elsewhere, this consisted a kind of emblematic recognition and legitimization of the Turkish language in an otherwise monolingual and ethnocentric education. And we can also see Turkish language learning here, its introduction to education as a tool for desecuritization that could kind of remove Turkish Cypriots from the sphere of the enemy and bring them back as citizens, as compatriots. This was the object of study for two linguistic ethnographic projects that I was involved. The first was part of my PhD at King's with Ben and my supervisor, one of my supervisors, and the second one was funded by Liverpool Trust, and you can get a sense of what they involved here. So we now draw on these two projects to move from language policy to the experience of teaching and learning a language that is associated with processes of insecurity. What we found out from these two projects was, first of all, that by having Turkish as part of the curriculum, this in a sense kind of schoolified it. So Turkish was recontextualized with the structures of the educational system and the usual classroom routines, and in a sense was normalized in this way. But still, it was indexical of the legacy of conflict, and it was always kind of the language of the enemy. And these had important implications for teachers and students. So all the students who participated in the project, in the two projects, they said in the interviews that at some point they had been called traitors or Turkophiles because of learning Turkish. There were even reports of vandalizations of classrooms, especially in the first project that it was the beginning of the classes. And as a result, teachers and students had to develop some practices for evading accusations and justifying the act of teaching or learning. So they could hide their books or develop argumentative resources that they had readily available for replying, why are you learning Turkish, or why are you teaching Turkish? Now, beyond the pressures from peers or even family, we also found that teachers had to also find some strategies to cope with the precarity and the insecurity of teaching in Turkish. And in a publication with Ben and Charalambous, we talked about 4 strategies, but here I'm gonna mention 2 of them because they show the entanglement of securitization with neoliberal commodification that Ben talked about in the beginning of this talk. So the first strategy we called in the paper Cosmopolitanization, and we also found it in both documents like curricula and accompanying documents by the ministry and in teaching practices. And it had to do with recontextualizing Turkish away from local realities in a European, multilingual, multicultural, cosmopolitan ambience. And this had to do with stressing, for example, in the curriculum, the European policy of mother tongue plus 2. So Turkish here was seen as one of the 2 extra foreign languages promoted in Europe. It was associated with discourses of multilingualism, and it was seen as an asset for the job market as well, giving access to students to jobs. The second strategy, which was by far the most widespread one, was what we called with Ben drawing on Goffman technical redoing. And this had to do with an attempt to kind of clear Turkish from any cultural, historical, or political association and reconstruct it as a neutral kind of linguistic code, as kind of scientific subject that could allow teachers to reinstate their epistemic authority when being challenged. Why are you teaching Turkish? Or any claim that had to do anything with culture. So this was an attempt to recreate Turkish as a safe subject to teach. And in this way could also avoid discussions of politics and reactions. And I have some examples now here to show this. So in the first research project, I followed one teacher that I called Mr. A. And out of the 29 hours of grammar-focused lessons that he taught, he only used the term Turks only 4 times. So this was a Turkish language lesson. But I have to say here that the term Turks is a very ambivalent term in Cyprus that always carries negative indexicalities. Sometimes it can be used interchangeably with the term Turkish Cypriot, but also sometimes it can be used as an insult, especially like a playful insult by the teenager students. And the differentiation between Turks and Turkish Cypriot was usually used within a reconciliatory discourse, and this distinction then was salient, as Turkish Cypriots were moved in the good side and Turks remained the enemy. So out of these 4 times that the teacher used the word terms, the term Turks or Turkish Cypriot, 2 of them were actually to establish the absence of communication with them as the norm. So in the first example here, the teacher constructs the absence of Turks as unfortunate, but still as the social norm. So urging students to study because there are no Turks over here to practice. In the second example, within the same urge, with the same request to students to study more, the teacher this time realizes that, well, we do have Turkish Cypriots, but we don't have any contact with them. The students don't say anything and the teacher moved on. But what's significant here is that there was contact. The lessons took place after the checkpoints opened in the buffer zone, and students told us in interviews that they visited the north, that they had contact. And this was for some of them, or for many of them, the reason actually for learning Turkish. But in the classroom, none of the students said anything, and they collaborated with the teacher to construct this absence of the other from the classroom and from the social environment. Here is another example from the same teacher. And here we see how, despite this effort to suppress the local context, and by focusing just on grammar, still here grammar brings it up as he teaches how to form questions in Turkish, and this is very different from standard Turkish and Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot use of it. So he teaches this suffix and then says to students that actually that's not how Turkish Cypriots ask questions and they don't use it. And here we see the entanglement of language standardization ideologies, how the standard Turkish is associated with more educated people, but then he cannot say to students, if you use it, you sound like an educated Turk. This would have very negative indexicalities and it would cause reactions. So in order to navigate this representation or this performance of Turkishness, he uses the word Cosmopolitanization, which is the Greek way of talking about the residents of Istanbul. So here is a Turkish language lesson, but the teacher uses the Greek word, which brings then associations of Greek identity and Byzantine history and the role of Istanbul in Greek history. Here we have another teacher from the 2012 research, and again we see the trouble of performing Turkish linguistic identities. When one student is asked to read aloud the test, another student uses Turk as a playful insult, and here the teacher, rather than reprimanding the student for his comment, he actually replaces the ethnic label Turk with the Turkologies, which brings again which again reconstructs the language as a scientific object of study that is disassociated from culture, politics, and the history inside. So of course, this is just a very fragmented picture that doesn't capture all dynamics at play, but it still shows how securitization and desecuritization processes go together with nation building and marketization, and all of them get entangled with language learning and teaching. And at least for us, it helped us to capture and better describe certain processes taking place in these classrooms that they make them different than other foreign language classrooms. So I'll now hand the floor back to Ben.
Overall, then we're saying that sociolinguistics needs to pay more attention to securitization. And here's a table summarizing the empirical description that we've covered in this talk and is covered in more detail in the working paper that we did. I mean, certainly there are big differences between the two studies that we've covered. Generically, we want to talk about insecuritization because we're particularly interested in the multi-directionality of interaction. But even in the two sites that we've looked at, we've seen different aspects of securitization. In Rio, counter-securitization, in Paporeto, counter-securitizing, recognizing existential threats, but advancing alternative analyses and solutions, but in Cyprus, desecuritization, proposing that groups, phenomena, or processes are moved out of special measures back into the realm of ordinary politics and civil affairs. At the same time, language standardization was caught up in all this. Hold on there. Standard languages themselves were linked to powerful forces that threatened or oppressed our research participants, either now or in the past. And indeed, in the struggle to escape the states of exception where our participants found themselves, these people engaged with powerful linguistic models without surrendering. Turkish and favela vernaculars were shibboleths, eliciting fear and suspicion, and both sets of actors worked hard at shifting those indexical values. With one, in Brazil, the shibboleth was embraced and elevated into Paporeto, and in the other, in Cyprus, the shibboleth Turkish was sanitized as a subject for school exams. Now, we're certainly not saying that insecuritization, we're certainly not saying that insecuritization inevitably problematizes standard language ideology, or that the communicative effects of insecuritization are easy to predict. But we are saying that you couldn't make sense of these language dynamics without bringing in insecuritization. What's more, it's no longer possible, I mean, quite obviously, it's no longer possible to suggest that insecuritization isn't really relevant to the study of everyday life in the global north. Okay, we've focused on two sites where security has been a long-standing concern, but in countries like the USA and the UK, the lines between police, military, and private security now blur and converge towards the same figure of risk and unease management, the immigrant, that's a quotation from Didier Bigot. cross-border refugee migration is regulated with necro power, and surveillance and everyday bordering penetrate deep inside national territorial boundaries in a country like the UK, requiring people to demonstrate that they have the rights to public services, employment, accommodation, etc., and those checks becoming increasingly visible and dangerous for those placed lower down the socio-economic and racial hierarchies, threatening people with exclusion, incarceration, or expulsion. Now, we think, and something to discuss, we think that sociolinguistics can offer some expert analytic insight into the communicative practices and effects through which these processes are materialized. And this contribution can either strengthen the fight against insecuritization, or alternatively move beyond the most obvious responses. But either way, we're saying that insecuritization calls for our attention. I think that's, we'll look forward to hearing what you have to say about this.
Okay, thanks a lot to our three presenters for sharing insights into the link between sociolinguistics and the theme of insecuritization. Sinfree, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. I want to start off with a very obvious question, which you briefly touched on. What is the conceptual relationship between notions of precarity and securitization, or the lack thereof? The idea of precarity and securitization. What sort of relationship do you see between those concepts?
Go on, who'd like to go on that? Either.
I can start, or Daniel, if you want, I don't mind.
Oh, you can go ahead.
I would say that precarity is an important experience of insecuritization. Securitization is a concept that has been theorized and that we use from security and critical security studies that involve certain processes, certain relations. And even if we kind of have adapted it from sociolinguistics, it still has some theoretical baggage attached to it as well. Precarity here is not a theoretical concept, but I think it's an essential kind of feature of insecuritization.
So,
we haven't rehearsed these answers, and we don't have we may well disagree on some of these things, which is
that's fine.
Of course, that's my personal.
Yeah. No, and I don't mean to say you're wrong, Dina.
That is the precarity of having multiple presenters, right? Daniel, you wanted to talk about
yeah, I just would like to add that, yeah, I think first we need to think of how we define precarity. I'm thinking of it just in the very basic common sense use of it. And as I try to point in my part, precarity in peripheries in Brazil has increasingly been dealt with through securitization, so it's first there was this idea of handling these precarious places with, say, education or rights. Everyone here is familiar with Paulo Freire's work, and he wrote his scholarship in a time when this idea of, like bringing rights to the oppressed was pretty much common discourse, at least in progressive circles. And now the register really changed to these peoples being handled through these vocabularies of public security and as enemies, etc. So just like a brief situated point about Brazil.
I'd love to.
Yeah. So precarity for you guys is a potential sub-element within securitization.
Well, but remembering that what Daniel says about the local circulation of concepts like precarity within, within the discourses that are influential in the space that we're looking at. So, I mean, we don't. I suppose what we don't have is a large theoretical architecture that we're trying to situate all sorts of concepts in relationship to one another. We do think that the notion of states of exception is a very important existential threat, are very important concepts. But and that's what we're kind of talking about in securitization, drawing attention to the communicative dynamic in that. But we don't want to, what we're interested in is using it to bring out, to understand more of what's happening in the situations where we live. I think that's
So this is where I'm a bit intrigued. Let me ask Ben this. I have, over the years, followed your career and publications. So what is intriguing to me is, how did you shift from being preoccupied with Campers, Himes, etc., to this particular phase in your career where you're more interested in the larger political aspects of politics, of scholarship? Or securitization, whatever it means, is predicated on the larger macro political forces and how they have a bearing on everyday interaction. So I'm just curious to know, how and when did you make that shift?
Well, thank you very much indeed for that question. And it's not a shift. It's not a shift. I haven't stopped being reading Gumpert's and Himes and you call it the micro, but this is the stuff of lived experience, and lived experience isn't separate from macro processes. Macro processes, have their effect through on the ground communicative practices. I started out reading Gumpert's and Himes, and when I was in the 90s, the 80s and 90s, then, well, I think, decolonial processes were happening in places like London, in the kind of mixing and crossing that you could see going on. And that was Gumpert's and Himes provided a very interesting set of tools for documenting and showing the everydayness of things that people were talking about in cultural theory. Gilroy, Hall, very important interventions, but weren't showing quite their everydayness. And that was one engagement. But then, British society took a turn. Well, no, that stuff's still going on. That vernacular, that alternative kind of vernacular politics, vernacular conviviality, that's still going on. But since the turn of the millennium, it's been overlain by security discourses, which Kamran Khan, person we've collaborated in, really kind of showed up. And if you do ESOL, suddenly ESOL teachers were supposed to teach citizenship to people, which they hadn't been before. and academic, university lecturers are supposed to check out that all their, they're not bogus students, and Islamic societies at universities are being scrutinized and so forth, so that so that the climate's changed. Gumpert's looks at, classically looks at gatekeeping, and that's still an important process. But now there's the element, you're well, yes, but can we see your passport too? Do you really have the, what's that foreign accent? Does that mean you're, you don't actually have the license to be here? So I don't think there's been any shift to engage with. I was lucky to supervise Dina's PhD, and when Dina started talking to me and Roxy Harris, and we'd both been working in the kind of multi-ethnic London multilingual environment, we were doing the kind of the hybrid linguistic stuff. When Dina started talking to us, we said, come on, stop it, new ethnicities, read Hall and everything. Dina said, and she kind of re-socialized us into what conflict could be. And then, lo and behold, you can see we started to talk. She drew us into conversations with people in security studies, critical security studies, who are also getting very interested in, who are kind of demacrofying, you could say. People in, security studies, international relations has historically been focused on geopolitics, but actually people like Didier Bigot and others are getting increasingly interested in the ethnographic, and with Emma McCluskey, who's Constadina's been working with, I've worked in, very interested in the local interactional dynamics. So I think it's pretty much connected. I think it is connected. And I would just say, I mean, my overall contention in this talk is that, sociolinguistics started as a sociolinguistics is an analytical rather than a normative project. Okay, it's about analysis and description rather than intervention. But in Heims's formulation, it does, and as Jan Blommer also kind of contended, it tries to do good analysis so we can speak concretely to actual inequalities, and it's having an understanding of the complexity of actual inequalities that lends itself, becomes useful to people operating as activists or sociolinguists when they take off their academic hat and step into their political hat and so forth. I don't know whether you two would agree with that.
Daniel and Constadina, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think what Ben said about now being difficult to ignore securitization processes is important here, because the way the world is changing. So sociolinguistics has the tools to analyze different now modes of communication, where maybe silence or silencing, or as the table said, stay alert, this alertness and surveillance are part of communication. Maybe it was before, but they hadn't paid as attention, but now it's more difficult to ignore them.
Yes, I think I agree with you. I think the critical issue here is that because sociolinguistics, to some extent, emerged in contexts which were under the illusion that violence was not central to everyday existence. That's why we only are now beginning to address issues about securitization and violence. If, for example, sociolinguistics had emerged in a former colonial context, then the issue of violence would have been quite central to how you imagine sociolinguistics. For example, the securitization, militarization are part and parcel of the everyday life in those contexts. The world that was created by sociolinguistics in the 60s and 70s, to me, it was totally unreal, in that it avoided the key issues that you guys are now talking about, issues about securitization. That leads me to the next point. What in your analytical framework is the relationship between militarization and securitization? Then I'll give over to Pastor. To what extent does militarization enhance insecuritization, or you see these things as completely different?
I think I can say something again from a very particular situated point of view. So when we three were studying to write this paper, we read a piece about the arms industry, basically like in the US, and this piece was about the arms industry in Israel and how that connects to particular policing programs in Brazil. And in the case, the pacification program that is now underfunded, but was a major policing experiment in Rio, especially as you followed the World Cup here and the Olympics. So there was this program to kind of like make Rio safe for these transnational investments. And it's very interesting how like military intelligence and weapons and etc. kind of are getting embedded into these, say, everyday security practices. And so there is this military ethos in these policies of like securitizing these spaces. And I would say that the field of public security in Brazil, as we call it, has really never been civil. Brazil came out of a military dictatorship in the early 80s, but there was never police reform, and the police are still like, we're always under military rule, that like we call the everyday ostensive policing of streets military police. But that's in addition to being military. I would say that this militarization is also another word for neoliberalization, in the sense that the military are part of the market, you know, and we have these platforms, etc. So these frameworks, like Ben was, you know, showing those three epochs of sociolinguistics, but you know, market and securitization, militarization are pretty much blended in what's happening in peripheries, not only in Brazil. You see that in Palestine and elsewhere.
I mean, that's a good empirical answer to the relationship to militarization. But I would like to just, you know, come back to your characterization of sociolinguists in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, I don't know whether sociolinguistics generated in the 1960s and 70s in, you know, in the global South, focused on violence more fully prior to the depredations of neoliberalism. I mean, that's a question I'm not able to respond to. But you know, I think sociolinguists weren't kind of blind. They were trying to describe, you know, the environments around them. And if you take out, you know, everyday experience where security concerns are not at issue, if you take out kind of mundane everyday life out from your analytic, what you look at, gosh, then in a sense you capitulate to the forces of securitization, saying that securitization is the natural state and everybody must be tuned to the possibility of violence all the time, in effect militarizing sociolinguistics. And it seems to me that people in, what we do see is that people who are in very difficult, insecuritized situations, the prospect of having an ordinary life is hugely important. It's a source of hope. I mean, Daniel can tell you talk much more about hope as an issue. So I think it's important not to kind of normalize insecuritization analytically, because then that you can play into the hands of, you can close down on the range of human experience and human experiences that are actually better, healthier than securitized ones.
Yes and no. I think human beings try and retain a level of normalcy and ordinariness, even in very difficult circumstances. So I would say the framework I'm talking about does not draw sharp distinctions or contradictions between normalcy and insecuritization, because even in moments of upheaval, what you try and do is to retain certain rituals to give yourself a certain level of normalcy, right? You are trying to capture ordinariness in contexts which move against that level of ordinariness. That's what I think might be happening. But anyway, let me give over to Basi, and then we can open up to allow other people to talk.
Okay, thanks a lot for the discussion so far. We have a couple of questions here in the chat. The first is for Constadina, and Vishna has a question with two parts. In the classrooms that you observe, what are the power dynamics like between the teacher and the students? And then how do those dynamics reflect? In other words, how do they shape the responses of the students to the teachers? Are the students able to push back or not? Are they hesitant to contradict how the teacher constructs Turks or Turkishness and so on?
That's a very good question, actually. And during field work, there were a couple of incidents when students actually reacted against the teacher. And these were incidents that had to do with the teacher leaving for a bit this sanitized grammar-focused lesson and touching issues of culture. So, for example, in one classroom, he was talking about grammar, talking about the politeness plural, and then said that actually Turkish Cypriot are polite, and this created then a lot of reaction with students actually challenging the teacher's epistemic authority, saying, how do you know this? Why are you saying this? And the way that this argument was resolved was bringing back the focus to language and talking about language as a tool. And when talking about grammar, this could reinstate the power dynamics in the classroom, and the teacher could also be more in control. And similar incidents also in the break time with other students challenging the teacher, why are you teaching Turkish? You're a traitor. And then again, the teacher would assume kind of apologetic position or using an enigmatic position, saying whether you see them as friends or enemies, you still need to know their language. So the students were able to challenge because of the dominant discourses that could reinforce nationalist views. But when talking about grammar and vocabulary, then the teacher could be more in charge in the classroom and bring back the usual dynamics that exist in school routines.
Okay, thank you very much. Rima would like to pose a question directly. Rima?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the amazing talk. That was really interesting. So my question sort of relates to the intersection between securitization and race. So my dissertation is a critical ethnography of transnational conflict and race in an Arabic community school in the US. And so what I'm finding is that while securitization is felt by all the members of the community, it's more intensely felt by some than the others. So for example, like, just to give you an example, so like the school is diverse, a lot of Christian and a lot of Christian Arabs predominantly, but some Muslim Arabs as well. And what I noticed is that the school as an institution is trying to navigate securitization by performing whiteness, sort of like trying to make sure that they remain a majority of Christian Arabs from the Levant region with kind of a phenotype that can easily pass as white. And so that, you know, at the sociolinguistic level also, it leads to the exclusion of people who may not pass as white, either because of their religion or because of their phenotype. So for example, like, you know, Sudanese Arabic speakers are kind of placed at the bottom of this racial hierarchy, basically. So I'm really curious about your opinion of how the connection between securitization and race should best be theorized.
I don't think we'll have a hand you down theory for you to make sense of it. But I mean, Daniel, this is an issue that you've been kind of engaging with in your field site.
Yes, I would say that the experience of racialization in Brazil is pretty much entangled with securitization. And just to give like very clear examples, Jennifer Roth Gordon has an amazing work in Rio's favelas. And she it's very interesting because it's a classic sociolinguistic study in the sense that she goes to a favela, she records people speaking, she does elicitation with her subjects, and then she brings the transcript to another setting. It's a middle-class white space. And then the people listening to it, they make comments about things like, wow, this is not Portuguese. This is a criminal's language. This is not correct. This doesn't exist. So the comments shift from, you know, not being standard to not being language, you know, because like some say sound words, like I forgot the name, you know, these sounds that we make of animals, etc. So, you know, so there's like this clear connection between, you know, someone's language and someone's place in society. And that, like, in very practical terms, in a city like Rio means that depending on the space where you are in the city, you're securitized differently. You know, I showed a picture of like Rio's and the contrast between, you know, the big buildings and the favela. And like a big discussion right now in Brazil is that most of Rio's space is not controlled by the state, but by what we call crime, which is the drug traffic and the militias, you know. So like a large portion of the city is controlled by exception. You know, and to live in a world where ordinary life is controlled by the state, and, you know, there's still exception there, but people live more freely. is like restricted to a small population and territory is a very complicated one.
If I should add something, I think there is room for theorizing race within securitization, and a lot has been written about migrants and securitization in relation to discourses of terrorism. But I was wondering whether your question is a theoretical one or it should be an empirical one, like something to find out how race is understood and to what extent it goes hand to hand with existential threats, for example.
Rima, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. No, I guess my question was more theoretical, like, because as I try to map those two concepts together, I feel like sometimes I have trouble because in the securitization literature, there's often no mention of race. And I was wondering maybe if you guys knew of something that can help me sort of like make the connection more clearly, or if it's, like you said, it's an empirical question that maybe needs to be pursued.
I think I have a. I think it is an empirical question, and just to jump on to Cecile's question. Cecile's got a question. She says, are the tools of sociolinguistics good enough to address questions of securitization, or is there a need for a radical theoretical shift? In other words, is the issue of securitization a new theme, or does it prompt us to rethink our analytical tools as well? Well, my answer to you, Rima, would be, stick with, get good at doing ethnographic description with linguistic tools. And I say this, coming out of, quite 2 decades, well, more than that, me, much more than that. God, I'm pretending I'm no, quite a long time engaged in interdisciplinary conversations. Speaking to people at the cutting edge of interacting with people at the cutting edge of, Black cultural theory or cultural theory in the UK, Gilroy Hall, that kind of work on the one hand, and then speaking to people at the, cutting edge of theoretical innovation in security studies, Bigot, Heisman's, people like this. These are guys who do theory and are much better positioned to engage in kind of really deep theoretical rethinking, philosophical rethinking than I am, kind of trained as a linguist. And they think that the perspective that we bring on communicative practice is something they can't do. It's something they're very interested in. They talk about it theoretically. They talk about practice and so forth, but they don't actually know how to analyze it in its fullness. And I think that my answer to your question and to Seals would be, yes, read stuff that's relevant, but don't, your contribution to or if you are kind of linguist, somebody who studies communicative practice, you have a contribution to make. You might want to leave the field and become some other kind of scholar, but there is, I think, a distinctive and valuable contribution in the tools developed by Gumpert's Heim's linguistic anthropology more generally, which is a hugely rich field, maybe a little bit, inward looking sometimes, linguistic anthropology, but maybe that's unfair actually, but maybe not as keen on reading across disciplines as people away from the US. But I think, well, that would be my position, that it is a powerful resource. And you know, there's I read it again in Marconi and Pennycook, the quotation from Dos Santos about the importance of not avant-garde but rearguard theories, artisanal rather than architectural work, work of committed witnessing rather than clairvoyant leadership. Now, it seems to me that the kind of stuff that linguistic ethnography does is precisely that kind of artisanal, committed witnessing, but committed witnessing, because, as Haim said, you know, 2 feet on the ground and 1 eye on the horizon. So, you know, it's not dumb and it's not kind of shutting off from things, but it's something that people don't take for granted, and lots of other scholars can't do. Sorry, yeah. Cecily's gonna.
Yeah, Cecile would like to jump in. I see.
No, I think I'm really struggling with that. Do we work in a disciplines that is just data producing, you know, or can we also theory generate, you know, can we generate theory? And I think I'm always struggling. It seems that I'm always a train. It seems that sociolinguistics is always a train late, you know, by following up, you know, what other disciplines has done. And we are, it seems that we are committed to produce data to basically ratify, you know, general social theories and stuff like that. And frankly, you know, I find it a little bit sad that we are so much dependent on all the social theories, that because it seems that we cannot come up with something, you know, that really may shift other fields' perspective. It seems that we are followers always, and that's one of my biggest frustrations. And I'm glad that you don't agree, Ben, but it's one of my biggest frustrations when I read social linguistic work. It's like, oh yeah, so now social linguistic handles, you know, this issue, and in a few 5-6 years that will be something else. And yeah, so I'm just, you know, debating with these ideas in my own world and in my own positioning, you know, toward the field. Well, I have no answers to that. Thanks.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the other two would say to that, and that would be, they may well have, you know, a different line, but you know, I don't think it's just ratifying the big social theories. I think it's interrogating them. And you know, well, I mean, I'll pick up one of my books, and you know, this is the book that Dina and Emma McCluskey produced. It's being produced in a series of Routledge Studies of Liberty and Security. You know, so it's been produced in another type of another arena of study. We've been doing work on surveillance, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, nobody's done anything apart from Rod Jones. Nobody in sociolinguistics done anything on surveillance. It's actually a topic that really invites interactional sociolinguistic analysis, and you know, we're able to publish in surveillance studies and so forth. So I don't think that we're necessarily. I mean, look. Let's not say we, because actually we have quite a lot of different identities, and you know, it may well be that there's a theoretical part of Vigarou which is not shooting off, fully engaged in theoreticals. There isn't in me. There, you know, I'm more interested in trying to make sense of the stuff that I have can see around me, and articulating it with practical stuff like language teaching and education and stuff like that. And there again, it seems to me that that's an important and useful conversation. So I don't think, but the other two may have a you know, I mean, I've thrown my dice, I've cast my position. I can't try and wriggle out of it now, but they may, Daniel and they might.
I agree with you, Ben, too. And I think that on top of interrogating also is nuancing. So, and this is important because you read all these big concepts in other theories that maybe they go first, as Cecile said, but then you read and said, but how does this work? But this is too vague. And then sociolinguistics can really take these notions and work them out on the ground, see the inconsistencies, produce new light of these concepts. And actually, like the concept of desecuritization, there was not very much about it in security studies, and people from security studies told us that we gave it a new meaning in this work, that they had only worked on it theoretically. That's just an example that happened. So it's not, it's committed to empirical research. You produce more substantial theory, but it can cover everything because you can have data about everything, but you can take a smaller part and then produce new meanings of it.
Daniel, I'd be really interested to hear what your sense of this.
Yeah, I don't know. It depends on how do we think of theory producing, and what does it mean to lead some theoretical path that others will follow, etc. I would say, I mean, especially being in Brazil, you know, living what we're living right now, you know, Bolsonaro, etc. I would say that my ambitions are much lower, and that it's really gratifying for me to see people like Rafael Calazans, who you saw in that clip, you know, engaging with us and like citing our work and doing his own theory as a, you know, like a public intellectual in the neighborhood with an impact that is much wider than the neighborhood. And something that just happened 2 weeks ago, you all know about Marielle Franco, who was assassinated, Black Councilwoman from Rio, and her family started an NGO, the Marielle Franco Institute, with like really interesting impact in Brazil right now, with all the alliances, etc., with other peripheries and institutions elsewhere. And Daniele Franco, Marielle's sister, is pursuing an academic career in addition to being a president of the Marielle Franco Institute. And guess what? She just got accepted for an applied linguistics program in Rio. She's going to be a doctor in applied linguistics. And I can really tell that, you know, like theory and activism and politics are getting entangled here. And I think that there is a lot of room for really novel theorization there. You know, this is something that maybe is not being discussed in social theory, etc., or can be discussed in different ways with these, you know, nuances from the field. Yeah, this would be my take.
Okay, thank you very much. 2 quick questions before I invite Sally Kuku. The first is to Danielle. Danielle, Marie would like you to elaborate on the shift from Paulo Freire to security discourses in Brazil. And then Ben, Ashraf wonders whether desecuritization could be a way of pluriversalizing the world. Could desecuritization hold the key? Is that the magic wand to pluriversalizing the world? So Daniel, you first.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I was actually thinking how to respond to it as I read it before. I would say, like, very briefly, that Paulo Freire had a framework of thinking of education as a way of freedom from the shackles of domination, in the sense that domination, oppression were a form of intrusion inside one's, psyche, affects, and etc. And I would say that the field of, say, critical education in Brazil and beyond are thinking of this domination, not only in philosophical terms, as Paulo Freire thought, but in terms of racial domination and of, police and military domination, with all the, developments that we've had in the world, etc. So I would say, if I could characterize this move, it would be along these lines.
Okay, thank you. Ben, would you like to take a stab at Ashraf's question?
Well, pluriversalize means diversify, does it? Ashraf, just give me the nuances of pluriversalize.
Thank you. Yeah, to have different perspectives, treated equally and respect. To be given the same recognition.
Yeah.
And have difference at the starting point.
Rather than a universalize. No, I wouldn't want to make a claim about that. I wouldn't want to, because in some places it may not be such a big thing, and I don't think, it is there have been big themes in sociolinguistics, standardization, commodification. We're saying insecuritization's been missed, but there are lots of other modes of government, modes of governance, forms of governmentality in play in the world, with, they may not be as powerful and have as widespread a distribution as commodification, standardification, and we argue insecuritization, but they may be just as influential or more important in particular venues. So I wouldn't want to. No, it's another thing that sociolinguists. Sociolinguists may be, well, actually, let me reverse that. Let me qualify that. I mean, we're not the first person to talk about securitization. We have to say we're not the first person to talk about it. There are, there are others. Security has been a theme for a while. We do think that the work wonderful work that Blomert, for example, did on asylum interviews, very much kind of in the securitization. Terrific work by Vigoru, Busi Makone on insecuritization in South Africa, in everyday encounters in the street, where people are worried about being. So there's quite a bit of I mean, there's other work going on. I just think that it has maybe been seen as a bit more of a kind of niche application than it should be, and that it can be useful. It can be useful for a subdiscipline or a discipline to start broadening its vocabulary a bit. And that's why we have kind of got these, that diagram where we did a comparison of standardization, commodification, and securitization. Those may be points of orientation, sensitizing constructs that it could, once students, I mean, where do people talk about insecuritization in textbooks? Even the wonderful book, Mehta and Bock, doesn't cover insecuritization, I don't think. the wonderful book produced by UWC doesn't yet cover insecurity. You know, maybe it needs to, be put on the agenda with some sensitizing constructs, theoretical constructs, which allows, you know, students to pick it up and think, well, okay, yeah, gosh, wow, now that I think about it, this does seem to be quite a significant element that I didn't before as a sociolinguist have terms. I didn't have the tools to really think about it, but now I do. So at that level, you know, to the extent that it provides, you know, our talk of insecuritization, pulling the stuff together, giving it, labeling a few extra concepts, loosens things up. That's great. But for me, neoliberalism, you know, neoliberalism and language, it's too much. It tries to conquer the world. The whole point of our discussions, is to see the entanglement of different regimes. Pluriversalize. I don't know. Maybe add a few more sensitizing constructs, but the overall project, I don't think, of ethnographic sociolinguistics. You know, the Heimsian project isn't a universalizing project. You know, Heims says we are going to do cumulative comparative generalization. Yes, we have to generalize, but it's going to be built up on very carefully on a set of case studies. So I don't know whether that yeah.
Yeah, just a follow-up. Yeah, thanks. It's an insightful answer. But what I'm thinking about, because you raised the issue of your engagement with interdisciplinarity and so on, and I might bring on board also at this point, simplest point, you know, about the that sociolinguistics created, constructed an unreal picture of the world. And that led me to think about desecuritizing sociolinguistics, not through interdisciplinarity, but through deprofessionalization of the field itself, by engaging the field with what's going on the street. And this leads me also to the question of the relationship between sociolinguistics, which works on securitization, and the actual real protesting and revolutions in the global south. So it's a question for you, Ben. What do you make of the revolutions and the struggles of the people in the global south for democracy?
Oh, I'm really glad you asked that. I am really glad you asked that. And you know, here we go. I do think there's a place for analysis. You know, I think there is a place for analysis. Of course, you know, as Heims, I'll quote Heims again. You know, Heims said sociolinguistics is committed to liberté, égalité, fraternité, solidarité. It is geared by that overall commitment, but it wants to develop tools to allow people to speak concretely to actual inequalities. Now, just so that I think there's a place for analysis, but I also think, and this is why, you know, sociolinguistics, there are normative. So let's call sociolinguistics analytic or descriptive. There are normative programs, sociolinguistic programs, and for me anyway, the ideas about linguistic citizenship developed at University of the Western Cape are a really good way of putting sociolinguistics, ethnographic sociolinguistic tools to work in environments where people can, you know, understanding more about language, learning language is helped by a sociolinguistic perspective. I mean, I don't know. Do you think? Would you say, Ashraf, that the notions of linguistic citizenship developed at UWC, contribute to revolutions in the global South? And if you would say that, then surely the links between the normative project of linguistic citizenship and ethnographic sociolinguistics are one of its strengths. It's one of the currents that give linguistic citizenship its effectiveness and its resonance is the links to academic sociolinguistics. Sorry, it's kind of loaded. The question is obviously loaded now. So.
Okay, thanks, colleagues. We'll just take the final question from Sally, and we'll draw the curtain thereafter. Sally?
Well, thank you. I just wanted to complement the discussion between Cecile and the speakers. In a way, I think what I meant to complement what has been said already. I just wanted to just add, as a consumer of ideas from other disciplines, that the purpose of doing this is to improve the quality of my analysis. And I think the problem is, after I have been inspired by other disciplines, how do I package my information in ways that can also attract the attention of people outside my discipline? And it could be that we don't package information the right way, but I can think of a number of examples where linguistics has actually influenced other disciplines. So I go farther back in time. Ferdinand de Saussure had an impact on the social sciences.
Yes.
And that worked out very well.
Yes.
And when Labov started quantitative sociolinguistics, I think there were people in other disciplines that took that as a model to follow. And of course, we have our own limitations. And what I see now is a return to humanism, where you don't just stay focused in your research area, but pay attention to the bigger picture and possibly bring other people in. In my experience, I was fortunate enough here at the University of Chicago to co-teach classes with people in other disciplines. And it's very interesting how many confrontations you may find yourself in, and how to learn to manage this, because differences in perspectives can turn out to be mutually enriching, especially because they bring up questions and issues that you wouldn't have thought of working alone. So that's the way. I guess if you are just working, you cannot anticipate how other people can react, especially outside your discipline, can react to what you are producing.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, I totally agree. How it's reconciled with the PhD, whether the PhD is well organized to accommodate that, I think is an interesting question. It may well be in some places, not in others.
But thank you all, the speakers, for a very stimulating presentation. Gave us a lot of food for thought. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so very much for sharing your expertise, your insights with us. On this forum, we've had a number of other presentations on the topic of securitization, and we have indeed been enriched by what you've shared with us. So we have a growing corpus of work and scholarship around the topic. So let me hand over to Sinfree for the last word, as it were.
Yeah, I think this has been a fascinating discussion. because I think it gets to the core of what we are trying to do. To what extent does our work remain just purely academic, or do we move further, in quotes, into the streets? And what is the impact of activities around us on the nature and type of work that we do? And what I also found quite encouraging about the discussion was the use and reference to the work of Achille Mbembe, for example, the Cameroonian South African political philosopher, that I think we are getting to a stage where we're drawing on a much broader range of scholarship, which I think does help us considerably. And Achille will be coming soon to talk to us about his work. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised that sociolinguists were discussing his work on necropolitics and its impact on sociolinguistics. Right. Thank you very much. Let me give